Our Bible reading plan has brought us to the book of 2 Samuel. Now, if you remember, back in the fall, we studied 1 Samuel, and I talked about back then that this is actually just one big book. 1 and 2 Samuel actually make up just the book of Samuel, and it was divided later on to put it into a little bit more digestible chunks for us. But this is all one story, all the way from the beginning where Hannah prayed for a son and God blessed her with little Samuel, all the way to the end of David's life in the end of 2 Samuel. All of this is one big story that a writer is writing for us. Now, we don't know exactly who that author is. Some people have said it's Nathan the prophet. The book itself doesn't tell us. Some early traditions tell us some things, but we can't be positive. But whoever it was, they were able to accurately reflect the history all the way from the beginning of Samuel's life to the end of David's life. Now, we've been following, if you remember, all the way back at the beginning of the book of Samuel in 1 Samuel, we had been following the story of the people of Israel. So whenever we study the Bible, we look at this narrative arc. And in this narrative arc, we remember all the way back in Genesis, God created all things. He created everything good. And then Adam and Eve fell. And they brought a curse on humanity. They brought a curse on the world. And mankind was separated from God. Because of our sin, we are now separated from God. And we deserve his eternal wrath. But he gives a promise at the end of this story of their fall. And he gives a promise that a descendant of Eve, a seed of the woman, is how it says it, is going to come and crush the head of the serpent, is going to come and redeem his people somehow. So now we're in this period of longing here, this period of anticipation and waiting for that promise to come in its fulfillment. And in the New Testament, we see redemption. We see Jesus comes to save us. So the book of Samuel falls in this longing section where we're waiting for the fulfillment of this promise. Now, the beginning of 1 Samuel comes right out of the story of Judges. And in the time of the Judges, there was no king in Israel, and everyone did whatever he pleased. That's something we see repeatedly in Judges. So the beginning of Samuel, we see Samuel comes up as a leader of the people of Israel, but he's not a king. He's a judge, and he's a prophet, but he's not a king. And the people of Israel cry out, they want a human king. So God is supposed to be the king of Israel, but the people want a human king to lead them into battle. So God gives them Saul, and Saul turns out to be a disaster. And then God replaces Saul with David. But the whole second half of the book of 1 Samuel is this story of Saul as an insecure king chasing after David, and David's in exile running around trying to keep from being killed by Saul. And then right at the very end of 1 Samuel, Saul and his sons are killed in battle. So then 2 Samuel begins with this idea that, okay, David, who has already been anointed king but is not ruling, the path is open now for him to be a king. So we've seen a couple patterns here in 2 Samuel, or we saw them in 1 Samuel, and we're going to continue to see in 2 Samuel. So the first pattern that we saw was this idea of a rising leader and a falling leader. So at the very beginning of 1 Samuel, you saw Eli is in charge and he's falling while Samuel is rising. And then as Samuel comes down, Saul is rising. And then Saul is falling and David is rising. So here we follow the continued rise of David, but then we see that even David, who's described as a man after God's own heart, even him, he ends up having a fall. He ends up not being the ultimate fulfillment. He ends up messing up just like all of the rest of us do, and in some ways way worse than the rest of us do. He ends up failing terribly. And yet, whenever we look at this big story arc of the Bible, David plays an incredibly important role, because in 2 Samuel, we'll see that it is from David that the person will come who will bring redemption. It is from David that the eternal king will come. So we are still looking for that one who's going to bring redemption. It at first seems like, oh, it might be David. David might be the guy. He fails. He's not quite there. So it anticipates and it explains who Jesus is in a lot of ways. If you open up your New Testament and you read it, you're going to see this linking back to David a lot. Who Jesus is inextricably tied to the story of David in the Old Testament. So we're going to learn a lot about Jesus in the book of 2 Samuel. Now, Another thing that we'll see in the book of Second Samuel is the idea of sin and its consequences. So there's a lot of really rough stories in Second Samuel. It's a difficult book to read through sometimes, and it's full of people behaving in ungodly ways, including David. And we see, as these people behave in ungodly ways, we see grave consequences to their sins. When they don't follow the way that God would have them go, they experience great consequences. And so not only does this story point us forward to Jesus and give us hope for a Savior, it also it illuminates our sin and helps us to see it for what it is and see that it has real consequences. And it urges us to avoid the sins of the people, of the characters that are in it. So it's part of a big story where human kings are coming up short, but it's in anticipating a greater king, the one who is going to bring redemption for us. I look forward to studying through 2 Samuel with you.